Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's welcome Dr. Amit Mukherjee once again to this particular session. Today, he will going to enlighten us on scientific temperament in higher learning for improvement in quality of education. Sir, on behalf of Department and AICT, I again welcome you to this particular session, and I request you to take the charge of the session and deliver the talk. Over to you, Amit
Thank
sir.
you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Bharti. Very good afternoon to all. Let me begin by thanking Professor Bharti, Computer Science Department, Marathwada University, Aurangabad, for giving me this privilege and the opportunity to be speaking to you once again. I thought I was lucky when I got the opportunity to speak once, but then twice is even better, and I'm so glad and grateful to the university and to the department and to ma'am for having provided me with this rare and very privileged opportunity to be talking to the audience once again. Before I start, I like to just give a few pointers about the talk that I'm going to give today. Um, the term or the word scientific temper or temperament, I have decided to use it intermittently, in the place of other, and I'll be shifting it, from one version to the other. However, I must emphasize or must clarify that they are two different words, and as we go along the slides, there is a slide which will probably be able to explain that there is a slight difference between how temper and temperament are actually distinguishable from each other. However, just to give a small pointer towards that, and temper in its very raw form is an expression of a single emotion or a single state of mind or state of being, whereas temperament allows you to choose a balance between many kinds of inputs that you may then filter before you express or raise the kind of attention or interest that you want to show towards a particular topic, subject, not anything. There's a slight difference, however, and we'll go through that in the presentation. But just for the sake of presentation, I am using them intermittently. I'm changing them from one to the other just to make the point more emphatic or clear. I am using some images which may have political connotations, but they are just to be seen as a representation and nothing more other than for the point that I'm trying to make. There may be some other kinds of images which are again in all its sense and aim and intent merely representational, while I'm trying to make a point on subject at hand. I'll also be adding, of course, my personal experiences or analogies to make my case or make my explanations of certain aspects a little more detailed, or in an attempt to make it more understandable as my perception goes. Um, um, so we can start, and the topic is, of course, as everybody is aware, it's scientific temperament in higher learning and its role in improving the quality of education. Let me begin by what our constitution kind of makes it mandatory for each of us as citizens, and in the list of fundamental duties, that we are supposed to have scientific temper that has been developing human inquiry and reform. So it is not something, even before I begin my points or try to give an overall idea or notion or concept or thought process of how scientific temper or scientific temperament is going to or is essential in our improving our higher education system or education system in general. Let me just again emphasize that it is part of our duties. It is not some kind of an additional responsibility that we may or may not be interested in or will interested in certain degrees, etc., in time and place that we may be able to do so. So it's very clear that within the ambit of the Constitution, which is the sovereign body of the country's rules, regulations, laws, etc. Is my screen still visible? Am I still audible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think I got disconnected. That can anybody in the audience confirm that my screen is visible and my audio is clear and you can hear me?
It is clear and your screen is also visible, sir.
Okay, I got disconnected. I'm so sorry. I think something happened in the net.
No
No,
issues.
All right. The point I was making is that we're not trying to. Thank you. We are not trying to push for merely the growth of subject of science, but as a way of life. And as we go along the slides, we'll be able to see what I mean by that. And it is not relative only to scientific subjects. However, the best examples do come from the subjects of science. So the presentation will, of course, when making a case for scientific temper and temperament, will allude to or will actually lead to examples from the subjects of science as such. I will also like to, at some point of time, be able to talk of some of my experiences where certain more advanced countries, more developed countries, use this in not just this kind of an aptitude or this kind of a tendency, this kind of scientific temperament in not just the science subject, but in subjects which are also, of course, social sciences, humanities, etc. So this is an interesting perspective I feel from my side that I may be able to present if I am able to convincingly give a few examples towards that. So some examples, our Vice President made a statement this year itself that the ultimate aim of science is to make people's life comfortable and happier, as well as to inculcate scientific thinking. Science is the foundation of any society as it deals with the truths of verifiable facts, logics, and experiment. He also mentioned that inculcating scientific temperament among society is key for the progress of societies. and for sustaining humanity as a, in the whole. So there are some leading examples from top leadership in the country. Of course, this spans all across the spectrum of whichever side we may be referring to. Then there was an inter-academy panel on ethics and science, which has recently issued a statement emphasizing the need to protect rational thinking, scientific temper in the country. We'll come into the more contentious issues if at all there is time or requirement for that. But then I do not see any kind of discrepancy between how we follow or pursue scientific temperament, or how we have been following scientific temper and temperament over the past 7 decades of our country's free history. So that is an essential point which will keep coming or keep repeating when we are discussing scientific temperament. As of now, just opening the presentation with certain examples of what is being said and what is being touted towards scientific temper at the highest offices of the country. So the Indian National Science Academy, Indian Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Sciences, actually together they were able to emphasize the need to protect rational thinking and scientific temper in the country. Um, it reflects a collective wisdom of the cream of Indian scientists, since all three bodies are at the highest levels of representation of the subject of science. So what is a scientific temper, or temperament as I am trying to term it? It is often mistaken by common people, as I mentioned earlier, as something which is separate or away from social practices and reality, and is only important or relevant to the scientific community, or as I was mentioning, the subjects of sciences, which is not true. It is applicable to everyday incidents of life or everyday activities of life, and within the realm of academic disciplines, it applies to all the disciplines that we are aware of or we are dealing with, which includes humanities and social sciences as well. And I'll come to the examples a little later. We can broadly define it as a very modest, in a very modest way, an open-minded temper, or a temper where there is an ever readiness to welcome any kind of new information, any kind of new knowledge, which can be born out of an experiment or from any other source. Especially not the term even when, but especially when the results are not favorable to some preconceived notions and that we have or that we like or have liked for a long period of time. So one of the most important aspects of developing a scientific temper is to actually be open to ideas and results of certain knowledge that are in very simple terms to speak, not more conducive to our line of thought or our expectations or our preconceived notions or what we have been comfortable with for a long period of time. So if we can develop that kind of an openness, mental openness or open-mindedness, to be able to welcome or understand or acknowledge or accept anything new where vis-a-vis knowledge and information is concerned. And I'm talking within the broad coverage of academics. I'm being very specific to that. And in general in life also, that is something which we can aspire for. But as of now, I am only talking within the umbrella or the coverage of academic disciplines as such. So as long as we are able to do that, I think we are on our way to having or developing a scientific temper. That's one of the most important, prominent, and opening points of having the attitude towards the right kind of scientific temper. As an individual and as a society, the process of thinking and acting, which uses scientific methodology and which may consequently include questioning, observing, testing, hypothesizing, analyzing, and communicating, are all parts of what we refer to as scientific temper. Now, here is the example, and I'll be coming back to such examples and such analogies with everyone's permission, is that this happens even in history. Now, history is not in sciences. We do our history. I have a degree in history, which is an arts degree. But when we go to verify certain aspects of historical credence, we do something which is basically dating the event or dating the archaeological proof or validity of the event. And the moment we do the dating, we are actually including tools of science or in very abstract form, we can say the tools of science, but in the larger interest or larger definition, we are actually using scientific methodology. If there were any other means or method, say for example, there was a method of verifying it through verbal discourse, which is not per se a science method or science subject method like carbon dating is, then that would be also applicable to to verifying this historical event that we're talking about, irrespective of how we verify. Okay, in present day, we do carbon dating, we do dating for verifying certain historical archaeological facts about when we try. But we also do interviews, we also do studies to understand, analyze, and verify folklores. We also try what has been going on as popular narrations from generation to generation. Many parts of our history within the country, due to several reasons, whether it was because there was a colonial past, because there was a political um, kind of direction that required a certain kind of history being set in one way or the other. I'm not going to go into the politics of it, but reasons be many. There is always a version which is slightly away or distinct from what really happened, because the person who's writing it, either he adds his or her own bias, or there is a general direction in which history is written. And we do some fantastic research here in our institution regarding this. Not me personally, but my colleagues have done how best to identify his. The point I'm making in all of this story is that irrespective of what tools and technology you use, the attempt to actually verify and validate a historical event or a historical location by itself becomes something which we are actually scientific temper. May I please request? May I request please to mute the? I'm sorry. All right. Can I request the audience to please mute their microphones, please? I'm. Thank you. All right, third point, it aims to inculcate the values of logical thinking and drive away superstition, religious bigotry, and all forms of pseudoscience, as well as illogical arguments or demands. And we can have a discussion on this. Time immemorial, this has been going on, and in every generation and every century, that there is something which comes up under the ambit of science, and something which is non-scientific gets erodes in chronology or in some part in some quantity as such. Scientific temperament leads to a state of mind where a person can make decision and act according to a rational belief and logic, which can be tested and validated as and when required. Please understand, when we are talking of our belief system, or when we talk of any kind of belief system, and I'll also be covering this in some middle slide and in the end, the belief systems themselves are not absolute. So it is absolutely improper to say that this is the absolute form of truth that exists, or that can be exhibited, and this is the only way. But this is one of the strongest ways that have come up, historically evidenced as a requirement for progress of society and country as such. So we are treating it as the strongest mode or method or attitude or approach for the development that we need to do vis-a-vis the academic realm and like I keep mentioning, general in life. So to achieve this kind of scientific temper, we have to develop logical thinking. We have to stay away from superstitions as much as possible. We do it still as we are going through this lecture. We all hold some habit or some gesture which is actually directly or indirectly connected to superstition. If most of us or some of us have been able to completely separate ourselves from it, then that's an achievement in itself towards having a scientific temper. Any kinds of sciences or any kinds of practice that do not have scientific rationale or arguments or requirements is also something which we can stay away from. Many of the slides and many of the points may appear contentious and we can or debatable, but try to understand that the points I'm making is not, again, not in the absolute form, but the abstract of what I'm leading to is how do we keep pure to the topic at hand, which is related to scientific temper. If there was a possibility of having a dialogue post the presentation, I would have probably been able to clear some of the things. But I'll try to do that as I go along. If at all I find some points which may have or which may provide or which may present slightly tricky undertones or explanations as such. I've tried to keep the lines and the points as clear and straight as possible, but I'll still do my best to see that if it doesn't put a gray shade on how it is presented or it is received at your end. So the point I made, and I keep repeating, is irrespective of any academic background, all of us must inculcate this scientific mentality amongst ourselves based on the points that I just mentioned above, and then we will be able to handle much better the way we handle our disciplines, and then that leads to betterment of the subjects, and then that leads to betterment of academics, higher education, and eventually society and the country as such. Mistakes, logical fallacies, they can be avoided by scientific thinking. In general, we are all emotional and passionate people and beings, and often make wrong and biased decision making when it comes to matters of self-interest. This is something which is inalienable to our nature, and hence it cannot and may not be possible to completely differentiate between what we are trying to achieve through the idea or the aim of having a scientific aim or scientific temperament. But as far as we can do, as far as they can bring out the practice of using logic, rational, and observation-based work in our disciplines, the better it will become as far as we are concerned or we are aiming for achieving our scientific temperament. In 47, we have already mentioned how we were able to bring in the scientific temper as a requirement of added fundamental duties of every citizen with Article 51A in 1976. Some of the notions that are related to scientific temperament, I'm going to mention them and say a few words on that. The notions are slightly different from what I present as tenets or principles. So the notions are more in the more evolutionary stage, and we keep developing it as time passes. But some of the important notions are that we should be able to develop scientific spaces and communication centers both in academic and social ways of life. We studied, we were able to hold a talk on communication skills and soft skills yesterday. This is merely a representation of it in the formal structure. So more places of scientific space and communication center is basically saying more places of places where we can carry or conduct scientific research. And again, when I say scientific research, I'm not just alluding to or pointing out to science subjects. Research centers is the best word to define it, and that can cover all disciplines and subjects and areas of study that we may have. So that there is a requirement of increasing it. If you compare us with any developed country, you will always see the kind of differences we have with the number of research institutions, irrespective of which subject and discipline we are talking about. So, of course, this is a very general notion, and that this needs to increase. The more research centers we have, and we are going about it in a very chronological and progressive sort of way, as far as I think. But there's always scope for improvement. If you note the changes that have been made in the new education policy, some of you may agree with some of the points, some of you don't. But this is an evolutionary phase in which the policy tries to, improve upon whatever exists based on the evidence that they have, and they've, I think, done more or less. Let me just say that they've done something which is evolutionary in many ways, if not revolutionary, as far as progress and inculcation of scientific temper or scientific temperament in our education system is concerned. One of the points I can actually directly attribute to is that of vocational training, which is not directly but indirectly related to the same concept, and that the vocational training or the vocational skill set will start at, I think, in standard 6, if I'm not mistaken, and that what it does is that along with your pure academic studies, etc., you also develop a skill set for for life or for a vocation, etc. The whole approach itself, I'm not talking about the enactment here, but the whole approach itself, I think, is very much scientific in its implementation and its design, because it is what we are trying to again here is develop the ability to develop again, a skill set to each individual according to their preferences, etc. Of course, there'll be so many systems of actually deciding what a person chooses as far as the training is concerned. But the whole idea is to make you dexterous in some particular skill set, which if it starts at a very young age, the kind of expertise that the person will have over a period of time is not probably possible in the current system, where we actually start developing skills uh, um, in our graduation and in our post-graduation uh, terms as such. So then another notion is, of course, very stringent, that there should be a separation of any kind of symbolic, basically aligning to any kind of political or such kind of affiliations as such, so that the pure goal of the research or the study is not tampered with, and then that is how a subject and a discipline will be able to go strong or grow strong. I do not see at any point of time, and this is again something which is debatable. Unfortunately, we do not have that facility or avenue to go into a discussion or debate in this thing, where it is a very old quintessential point and counterpoint about how faith and religion and such social practices either complement or they contradict the growth of science. I do not see a contradiction in the lineage of belief system, in whether it's faith or whether it's any kind of other system, anything that one may have, compared to what we are aiming or trying to scale here with the growth of scientific temperament. But that's me. Okay, I'm able to resolve this dichotomy or this kind of a struggle, but it does exist, and it needs a much larger time-based platform to be able to actually separate one from the other. But we are not going into that as far as today's talk is concerned. So today we're just going to focus on within the academic realm, what should be done as far as inculcating, encouraging, promulgating, promoting scientific temper is concerned for our academic work and academic disciplines. Propagation of science or science-related methods is the proper word and phrase that should have been used here for societal development, should go through various forms of observation, should go through various forms of government public funded sources, which is already happening, which has happened in the past and which continues to do so. It must be aided and complemented with feedback from the academic community, and there should be a reciprocative communication that happens between the decision maker, which is the government in this case, and the people who are implementing the academics through the realm of scientific temper, etc. It is also important that the subjects of research should not become fixated on or within the community of the researchers as such. So there is a requirement why the society needs to be more educated, or society needs to be told, or society needs to be shared with the kind of research that academic institutions do or research institutions do, and how it is in the aim or best interest of the society at large. So this is some kind of a requirement that actually will feed into the increase of scientific temper within the society and the country. If it is limited to the researchers, if it is limited to the academics and the group of academics we all know how we get into academics for various reasons of interest and inspiration that we have. But if we do not spread our contribution to the society as much as it should be, and if this separation that exists between, oh, this is very scientific, they sent a rocket into the moon, or they sent a spacecraft onto the moon, they made a supercomputer, there is this very large disconnect between the society in large, in general, and then that elite or very limited academic grouping that has. So increase it in such a way that this limited academic group or this limited research group, or I'm using limited just to make a point here, it is also very large in India, and it kind of disperses itself within the society. So it becomes the whole essence of scientific temper becomes not just something which is within the academic realm, but it kind of swims across into the civil society and into the academic realm to and fro. So that kind of a dispersal, that kind of a dispersion, I'm sorry, is essential, and that should happen at a level which is common to all. That is how we will be able to generate scientific temper in higher learning, not just within the realm of the academics and the institutions and the research centers, but these general society at large, and that is the idea. So this example that I think I'll bring along at some point of time later is about a certain developed country I was privileged to visit, and how this dispersion between the scientific temper which exists in the civil society, which is much larger always than the academic grouping that exists, or the research grouping that exists in any country for that matter. The population will always be large, the scientific grouping or the academic grouping will always be a small portion, significant but smaller portion of the population. But the kind of flow that has dispersed between the larger and mass society I'm representing here and the academic, the fluidity of this scientific temper between both makes the unison of all aspects or all components or all groups of society into one single level of awareness, and that awareness is of course the scientific temper that we are all referring to here. So of course, public agencies, government agencies must encourage science communication activities, and as a social responsibility to promote rationality, inquiry, and questioning. Um, that's how we have. I mean, I will link this to all the democratic values that we have at a much larger level. But it is also important to have or to do this at the institutional levels that we all come from and that we represent. So there has to be an encouragement for increasing or complementing science communication activities. So the separate field of science communication has also come up in several institutions where this aim of actually dispersing or distributing knowledge that comes from high-end research can be made accessible to the common public or the common masses, so that they understand how relevant this kind of activities are. And then that generates, that gets into the feedback loop or the loop itself of how a scientific temper within the society begins to grow. So once that understanding of what high-end research does, or even if it's not high-end research, but it is a dedicated research of some activity in certain disciplines, if this direct benefits are explained to the en masse, the people en masse, and they understand how it benefits, there is more engagement, direct engagement between the public and the specialist academic community that we have. It happens in other fields as well. It happens in sports, it happens in politics, it happens in social activities, etc. But we have to achieve this at a much higher level as a phenomenon within the country as far as our academic system and our education system is concerned. And that's why they started this thing. We are one of the leading science or scientific countries in the world, despite being a developing nation, despite having the challenges of being low on certain resources, economics, etc., and so many other social challenges that we have. But the reason why we are able to still manage and maintain certain highs in our academic system, or the number of literate people that come out in the country, or the number of qualified people that come out in the country, technical or otherwise, is one of the largest in the world. Yes, there is a problem of accommodating all that number of technically qualified people in jobs and other things, but that's a separate subject. What I'm trying to convey here is that whatever they did, to an extent, it has succeeded. Whatever they did in the past 7 decades and all, and whatever the government is now, present government is now trying to do, is to again move forward, move onward to meeting these challenges of having so many qualified people, but then accommodating them with the proper vocation and source of employment, etc. So the whole idea is again to get, even if we were to solve this problem, if we applied scientific temper or the scientific methodology for finding the solutions, which is how it's done. I mean, which is how they come to the conclusions. It's not perfect. It's always evolving. There are so many challenges that are there. The number of engineers or the number of doctors that come out every year from the country is probably second largest in the world uh, in numbers, and to be able to distribute or to be able to deliver every one of them with employment opportunities or earning opportunities, etc. It will require a huge amount of investment into finding a solution which is very complex. So on one hand, we have an excellent academic system which churns out so many qualified people, and then there has to be an equivalence in those qualified people being adjusted. That is a real challenge as far as society and country is concerned as far as now. But all attempts, even though they are imperfect, and of course there are a lot of shortcomings which come up in every attempt to solve such complex problems, the direction is again to be able to get going in the direction where we are able to solve such issues and problems and challenges at large. So that is where the government agencies should, ideally, are supposed to come and encourage and kind of facilitate the communication between scientific community, academic community, research community, and the society at large, so that everybody is involved and everybody understands the complexity of the issues and is able to, when deriving or attempting to derive a solution, is able to use same kind of scientific temper or temperament that we are trying to question here, or trying to portray here. So there has to be a solution, and there will be a solution. It may take time, it may take diversity of approach, but it will come. It has to come. I mean, there will be the solution may not be the best that can be achieved, but the solution will come. It'll only take, of course, it'll take time, and of course, it'll take a multitude of efforts, and a lot of failures might go into that. But eventually, that is what, if the aim is, that's how development cycles happen. That's how, whether it's in economics, whether it's in certain other areas, that's how the cycle of development goes. And hence, in this also, it will go. The most important point is, if there is this equivalence of scientific temper within the whole society, and not just in the academic research and institutions of higher learning, then that process reduces in time, I mean, in relative and comparative terms, than without having that kind of an approach. We are a diverse country. We have so many traditions. So to be able to promote scientific temper among them requires special attention. And this has to be from various kind of uh, roles and responsibilities that can be done by people who have access. Do not misunderstand the word elite here. That is only to elucidate the point that the people who have access to these kind of resources, the people who have access to this kind of scientific temperament, who understand how it helps, even though you may not be able to put scores on it, are should be more responsible towards the dispensation or the dispersion of seeing to it that they play their roles in covering the vast canvas of how scientific temper and how scientific temperament uh, can be given. And there's a small example that somebody put out. It's basically, we can always go with Swami Vivekananda's approach, and the balance between how belief system and religious or other activities do not overshadow or do not contend with or contest with the growth in scientific temper, etc., which in India's case has mostly worked in a very positive sense. the electronic media of the country should also not be irresponsible. I mean, I am taking these points from people who made these presentations at a much higher level, people who are much more qualified to speak on the topic. So there are a few direct and strong words and opinions that they have shared into. I would rather say that the media should be more responsible towards the increase or the enhancement of scientific temper and temperament within the society, and not lead the other way around. It should not be contested with what is shown or explained in media and what actually is the aim and goal of the people who want to propagate scientific temper and temperament society. There are a lot of observations that need to go through, and these observations and these kind of high offices must check the spread of information through false information or wrong information through media. I can distribute this into so many different aspects that we are already aware of within the country, whether it's fake news, whether it's certain things, but I'm not going to be very pedantic on the type and inclusion. I'm just trying to say that in the whole attempt of media, or the whole responsibility of media should be to actually portray and project things that enhance, support, promote uh, news or information related to or that are inculcated within the aspect or the idea of scientific temper, rather than showing things which are more eye-catchy or saleable. But that's how unfortunately, that's how most of the business models work. But that is not a notion that can be supported. And of course, in whether it's the government, whether it's some research body, or whether it's us, we will always cite an example, or we will always try to say that the media's responsibility and role should always be to portray anything that actually inculcates and improves scientific temper, rather than anything other than that. So the highest leadership also mentioned scientific temper, in which he said that the society in which the scientific temper increases, it increases the strengths and it develops equally fast. So this is something that the requirement of scientific temper, the enhancement of scientific temper, it starts at the top. So there is unison within the government, which is there, and then it is supposed to trickle down. And if it's a two-way process that I'm trying to bring out here, whether you call it a grassroots process, whether you call it a two-way process, or multi-stage process, where the government is, of course, the highest body of decision-making and authority in streamlining, and they've done, according to me, they have done a stupendous job of actually restructuring many things. Now, let me make a personal observation here. Please feel free to not agree with what I'm saying here, because this is more in the personal perspective that I want to sell. Irrespective of whether we agree to the changes that have been made in NEP 2020, National Education Policy, irrespective of the agreement or disagreement we may have with how things were and how things are going to be, because there are some drastic changes that are happening in the school and the high school education and the college degree education, with timelines being compressed, with degrees becoming segregable. That is basically, if you finish a particular year, you don't need to continue all the years to get a degree. With every completion, one will have a certificate certifying the equivalent merit that you are able to complete. 1 year has a different certification, second year has a separate separation, and if we are able to, of course, if our students are able to complete the third or fourth year in this case, they'll get into the graduation degree, and then there's an integrated degree of masters, etc. So I'm just quoting examples of what has been created, or what has been guided in the new directions, as far as new directions are concerned with education policy. But that is again something. Again, I've already repeated this time, whether we agree with it or whether we are in disagreement with it, has been done with a lot of in a single phrase, if I were to say, with a lot of scientific temper and temperament to meet some of the challenges that will be facing in the times to come. Yes, it will also evolve. There are things that will also change. There's always an experimental or experimentation that goes on whenever this kind of a drastic change or this kind of a radical change comes into certain into an education system or education policy as such, especially in the higher education ranks. But the people who have actually studied this, people who have actually promulgated or created this thing are one of the leading experts of the country. And when I say leading, I don't mean from any affiliations that they may have had with one side or the other side or this group or that political party or that kind of and I have the privilege of actually uh, come from an institution where the chairman of this new policy is also a member of, etc. So I've seen how many years went into this kind of deliberation, how the results came up, and I'm sure there is still a lot of scope for improvement, or still a lot of things that may change with observation, etc. That's how the things work. But the whole idea of actually coming out with these kind of ideas is irrespective. Again, I'm saying whether there is agreement or disagreement on the whole or some part of it, is that there is a huge amount of a huge element of that scientific temper that we're talking about in giving the direction of what the education policy should be of. How do we define a temper of science? How do we define or how do we describe this scientific temper? We saw the notions, we got the idea, we saw what the some of the country's leaders have spoken about it. We saw how it's been added in the tenets of the Constitution as a national duty. It is not something which we have a choice for. It's not under the responsibilities, it's under the duty. So we have those kind of unison or those kind of common, for what you call frame of unity of thought, unity of intent, unity of action, moving towards it. And this has been since independence. Okay, so even the first prime minister also was very vocal about how scientific temper be will be crucial for aiding the nation's growth. And when I say how emphatic the person was, I mean in many speeches, including the book, there is a direct reference to an importance placed to scientific temper and how the country should be, move forward. Of course, with time, things change, approaches change, direction changes, but in the whole uh, historical context, it's an evolutionary phase that goes from one stage to the other, but the evolution keeps happening northwards, or what I mean is in the positive direction. So what is temper of scientific temper, or what we call temper of science? It's a state of being. That's what we started it by saying that it is not related to only a subject or the subjects of science or the disciplines of science. It's a state of being. It is conviction, expression, and action based on certain rationale. And those rationale, those logics are they are not absolute, but they are at the moment that you are applying them the best way to move forward between the choices that you have while taking an action. So that's the source of the conviction and the expression of that conviction through action. So this is much larger than merely how you practice the temper of science or scientific temperament in just a subject or a discipline. How is consistency and I'm sorry, the consistency and coherence is also a mark of scientific temper, not just science. So that is the whole essence of how this method works. One cannot choose to use scientific temper for one activity while dismissing or dissolving or deriding its application in some other factor. A choose as you will kind of approach does not work. So there has to be a consistency, coherence in this temper when you apply this to all aspects of life, society, subject, academics, disciplines, and higher education, or to achieve higher quality of education. So it is also to be supported by ethical values that motivate the scientific community, and of course with the right mode of communication, which we already discussed in length about how we disperse whatever we achieve to the society, and we explain how it is going to be best for the society at large. Um, these are one of the principles that any student, while pursuing studies, should refer to while evaluating the knowledge that one gets, thereby calling certain actions or aims as rational and demarcating these from irrational or unscientific. There is a huge debate which we are all aware of. We don't need to be privy to the movie Three Idiots that we all probably have watched, that there was something missing, or there is something missing, where we are able to produce excellent scientists, one of the world's best. We are able to produce excellent engineers, one of the best. We had one of them just become a CEO yesterday or day before yesterday. We have a plethora of these kind of high achievers, all produced in India, going and leading the world's biggest institutions, etc. But yet, when it came or when it comes to, I'm now referring to this very local movie that we all probably know, Three Idiots, where it was also something which was trying to portray that scientific temper, ability are more important than merely the traditional ways of how we learn things, which is mostly based on course curriculum, rote learning, etc. We may not be able to immediately shift from that requirement, because that's also an essential requirement when it comes to the kind of system, society, and the world that we live in. But the awareness itself, it comes from the same temper of science that we are all referring to. The awareness that we need to move from being merely, workers to being designers, from being uh, merely an expert and actually getting into uh, or being called an engineer, etc. So all those things we are all aware of as Indians. All those things we are, as a system, as a society, as a government, as an academic representative, we are all trying to move forward, where we are able to, be the difference between a person who is just a worker and actually be somebody who designs or engineers a new concept, rather than just process of process whatever already is existing. So that kind of a transformation that we used to be, we were there, including pre-independence, especially post-independence, the first few decades and all. We did have that kind of an approach, but somewhere along the line, for whatever reasons, that has diminished, and that is an accepted notion that we have within our country, and that we are trying to, all of us are trying to transform from that state to where we become designers and engineers and scientists who create things rather than merely process it. We must all, as the temper of science, must always follow a rational belief system. Now, here is a comment I want to make about belief systems. Faith, religion, any kind of other concept or in any equivalence, is they are all belief systems, and all belief systems have their limitations. Based on what we choose is going to give us the benefit or the expected benefit that we are aspiring for. That is the line we are supposed to be able to judge, evaluate, and then finally take. Now, given that it started with how it was enshrined in the Constitution, how the world Indians leaders have emphasized its importance, how we understand that this is actually really the best way to go forward. And it is in the availability of belief systems, it is the most strong, or it is the strongest system with which we can actually um, maintain or actually achieve the aims that we are looking for in the improvement of the society, in the improvement of higher quality of education. I keep repeating the word society because I kind of merge the generic requirement in the higher quality of education, or increasing the quality of education in higher education, to its actual impact on the society. So whenever I say one, I'm actually also including the other. So please bear with me, because if I'm not able to, every time I repeat society, please may understand that it already includes, and with an emphasis and an exclamation, the quality of improvement that we need for higher education. It starts at the lowest levels or the basic levels, and hence it is in the schools that those changes have also been brought in the education policy, etc. But the aim is to have a seamless kind of stage or transformation or stepwise increase from the schools to the intercollege and finally into the college and higher other higher levels of education all the way. I'll also come to a point at something where you find very little literature about how the same temper of science can actually be encouraged in the highest education degrees and qualifications that we pursue. And it's not that we just because we chose something which is a science subject, that is the only place during our graduation or during our master. We have already been used to the inclusion or use of the scientific temperament, but there is a huge amount of learning curve that still needs to be made available to both in the scientific disciplines and in the non-scientific disciplines. Not much is covered as far as literatures go within the country. Most of it is focused on school, and rightly so. Of course, if you are talking of improving scientific temper, it always should start at basic levels. But then the same things in a country, in a society here, there is still catching up going on. It should also be an important part of undergrad and postgrad studies, and even further. I mean, that is a system and inculcation that goes on for a longer period of time. It is not just limited to, like I keep repeating myself, not just limited to people who are pursuing pure subjects of science, but um, all the subjects and disciplines as such. And I do find a gap or a shortage in actually in certain aspects, in certain disciplines, in certain subjects, where even higher level this temper of science or scientific temperament sometimes is found missing. That is changing, and I'm again making a relative comparison here. I'm not trying to another country or another society or civil body as such, but if you compare and if you have the open-mindedness to actually accept that yes, a certain of bodies, and let me call body, let me not address to them as countries or society, a certain group of people, a certain group of you know, academics or academic institutions or research organizations have been able to implicate this at a slightly higher level. All the disciplines I'm talking about, I keep repeating this, all the disciplines, is because I see that there is a huge amount of inclusion of scientific temper within the science subject, but it needs to be dispersed more in all other disciplines as such. And that is where this relative comparison is what I'm trying to bring. In developed countries, in developed groups of bodies who carry out these kind of researches, you see there's a similarity in the scientific temper used by all subjects and disciplines all across the board. Whereas when it comes to our case example, you find this in abundance in, of course, certain disciplines and certain subjects, but there's lack of it in others. So that distinction I'll try and clear. It wouldn't be fair to say it lacks in history, but it doesn't lack in physics, because that's not the way to be able to approach this issue. But certainly, yes, in certain things, this whole approach, when you're studying science, this automatically gets ingrained into it because of the nature of how you're supposed to experiment and how you're supposed to meet the observations and all. So I'm more worried or more concerned, but not worried, concerned about subjects where that kind of practice is not inbuilt into the academic course curriculum, etc. So that is where this actually also needs to be enhanced and evaluated at even higher levels. By the time the society transferred, by the time the NEP takes place, and we have something the results that we see of this transformation, we're talking of 2 decades from now at least, if not less, even though implementation may start in 4 or 5 years. The intended result, so it is this, during those 2 decades or so, the way to bridge the gap as far as temperament is concerned in all disciplines, the science disciplines, actually to have this what you call an abstract way of actually uh, implementing or inculcating it even at the highest levels of degrees and qualifications. Uh, a temper of science helps us to be in ourselves and on the basis of real observation and argument rather than the archaic concepts. So we test everything, we question everything, and then we validate and verify the results, which we all do in the science subjects as such. We develop, or we're supposed to develop, a key sense of observation and must have curiosity. Now, I don't know whether I'm fortunate or unfortunate, I don't know, but I come from two streams of the subjects of both science and the arts. So I have my graduation, undergraduation in social sciences, and I also have a qualification in in computer science. So not that I am an expert in all of them or in one of them for that matter. That still for me is still an evolving process. But the point is that I am able to see the difference in how subjects run their course while we learn them and where the differences lie. So from my very tiny, limited, humble, modest experience, I am able to see where our where these kind of differences lie vis-a-vis the scientific temperament that we're talking about, or the temper of science we're talking about, and then compare that with some other developed place where this difference between the science and non-science subjects vis-a-vis the temper of science does not exist. So that is the source from where I'm trying to come. I'm not saying that we are not better or we are not as good as any. We are actually, and that needs no explanation as such. But it's the skill that I'm talking about. So in our case, if there is a percentage, I lost a connection there. I hope I'm audible and my screen is visible again. Uh, so
Yes.
that kind of a difference is extremely visible in our system, and that's where we need to bring uniformity as far as. Thank you, Dr. Sridevi. Thank you for that confirmation that we should be able to get it across. So again, please do not misunderstand me. I'm not trying to say somebody else is better than us. We are one of the best in the world. Look at the history of what we have been able to achieve as far as S&T is concerned. Look at the history of what we have done, being able to generating world-renowned historians as such. Forget about the politics that we see, and forget about what is shown in films and movies and other channels as such. But we have the world's leading scholars, we have the world's best researchers. Of course, when we want to give an example socially, it's more acceptable to say, look at the rocket sciences that we are doing, but we have an equal amount of achievement and success where literature may be concerned, or where humanities may be concerned, the social sciences may be concerned. So please do not take it as a direct comparison of that we are not as good, or that I'm trying to say that we are lacking in anything. I'm just trying to say that it's about the scale. Okay, so that's where it is important, that the scale at which, it doesn't mean that there isn't a history department here within the country where scientific methodology or temper of science or scientific temperament is not being used by the professors, the researchers, the scholars, the students. They are doing it. And there's not one, there are hundreds of them. It's about the scale I'm trying to talk. It's about the scale that we all need to converge on or meet on, so that there is the average is much higher, or we are able to reach a higher average, so to speak, in how much scientific temper matters to us within our academic community, within the quality education in higher education sector. Okay, so we already know that there's a keen sense of observation and inherent curiosity that is extremely important. And a person with scientific temper does not take things at face value. This is self-explanatory, so there's nothing much I would emphasize. But the key questions of why, how, and how, we all know that we are at the stage where we are supposed to be teaching this. That the questions that the students must ask is why and how, not just where and what. Uh, uh, what is more surprising is that there is a more proactive approach towards innovations and problem-solving approach in rural India rather than in the urban. This is an observation made by a very reputed institution or research institution in the country in one of the reports. I'm just paraphrasing that, and that's where we are actually excellent. We come from yesterday. Also, I gave a very colloquial example where it was something very local. All of us know that we sometimes use the word jugaad, and that's basically being able to be resourceful when, especially when the resources and the requirements are in short. So that's where this line comes up that probably people, this whole tendency to think that it's only the urban centers which can have a temper of science, a developed temper of science, or developed scientific temper is actually a wrong notion, incorrect notion, because observation says that there's much more scientific temper available in the mainland India, rural India, or semi-urban areas, rather than merely the urbanized centers, which do become the hotspot of education, and because of bigger universities, because of more access to resources, etc. That's how the system goes. But if you were to search for curious minds, that's where the grassroots solutions come into play, and that's why the emphasis now is being on finding people with that kind of an approach from all places rather than just urban locations and known locations. So finally, we come to then how does this affect? I've been going on all along by saying that scientific temperament must enhance or improve the society. Scientific temperament is the topic at hand, of course, was about improving the quality of higher education. But what's the point of improving the quality of higher education if it is not to actually benefit the society in large and the nation thereby? So when I used, I'm again, I apologize, and I'm repeating myself here several times, is that whenever I'm using, just like scientific temper and temperament, I'm intermittently using one for the other. I'm also using society and quality of education for higher learning as one for the other. So my intermittence for using one word for the whole phrase is also to be taken in that context. So how do we expand our horizon to scientific temper and then benefit into the society? The whole talk about that is there. Yes, there is a direct result of in the attempt of actually trying to improve scientific temperament within the country, which again, for the third time I'm repeating, comes from the constitutional duty, and then the leaders of the country, and then how we have the government and the public systems developing our institutions that improve scientific temper in society. That is that needs to be enhanced, and that needs to be done through, like I said, the duty of the academically qualified, or the people who are in the zone, who have achieved some amount of scientific temperament. It becomes their responsibility to actually put this message into the society at large. So there are lots of these movements and lots of these uh, events that happen, but the level at which it happens, even for the last few years, of course, last 2 years were COVID ridden, so it didn't take off at the scale that it is supposed to take. But then uh, it needs to, and it has grown from 2014 to I attended it in 2018, I think. But the scale, again, it is the question of the scale, and the scale at which this is happening is much smaller than at what requires to be, or it has to be. So again, this is not to be taken as an increase uh, in the aspiration of joining the sciences, but it is very much for the growth of scientific temper for all the students, all the students who are becoming aspirants at a very young age when they join school, etc., and all the way to higher education system. So this is neither this concept should neither be limited to merely a group or a level of schooling or learning, and it should also not be limited to the the section of a particular section or sections of the society where this is supposed to be promoted. So that kind of a universality, that kind of a widespread promotion or dispersal of this idea that this is something related not just to the subjects of science, but for every other discipline that exists, and how this benefits the society, how this benefits the country, all of that needs to be enhanced at a much larger scale than what is happening. And it is happening in what you call in most cities, or I witnessed it in Bangalore, but needs to grow much larger. Yes, the debate will get into at some point of time that this is more about encouraging science subjects as such, and this as there is no direct relationship to the other subjects and disciplines as such, but um, it automatically, or it in time, it actually filters into every aspect that it needs to get into. So it may be led by people who are in the sciences, but then the same filtration, or the same the concept of it spreading into the other subjects as such will eventually happen. So, but it is being led, of course, it is being led by people who are in the sciences. But when you see the marches have people from, even though the organizations or the departments may be more scientifically oriented or science oriented, but the participants as such come from varied subjects. And I was also very privileged to have attended one of these meetings for the first time in my life, pretty late in my life also, uh, where I saw what kind of audience comes to interact, the same kind of scientific temperament, etc. And these speakers who are there at such a podium do not just belong to the subjects of science, they also come from social sciences, humanities, etc. But the way everything seamlessly unites as to the problems that are discussed or as to the solutions that exist, and how it transforms or translates from something which is very, very purely scientific to something which is absolutely non-scientific, but in effect solves a big societal problem or a big societal uh, uh, issue or challenge. It's just mind-boggling to see that kind of a transformation happen from a single stage with just 4, 5, 8 speakers of different disciplines, and how they integrate it into all of this from the source of the problem to the solution and to the implementation of it. So that is why I keep emphasizing about it not just being subjects of science, but for having a much larger reach than that. Tenets. So these are more stronger practice lines that one must inculcate to be able to develop or advocate or practice scientific temperament. You know, one must be able to have healthy skepticism. So uh, even though most of these things are very, very self-explanatory, I'll just give a line or two to explain how this works. And the healthy skepticism is again not something which you use with your bias or with your prejudice against, other intentions. And now I'll be with your permission, I'll just use some simple examples. I mean, it should not have a political connotation. If you want to get political, you please choose that line and become political and go and oppose something that is there in that you're opposing as such. But when you're talking about promoting scientific temperament within the student community, within the society, within your working environment, and especially when it comes to higher education, higher learning, one must be able to separate. So just by saying healthy skepticism, please pardon me for emphasizing this, it should not be used as tools for other disruption. Rather, it should be a normal practice. It should be known about you that this is what will happen if you are thrown with some kind of a notion or some kind of a principle or some kind of a phenomenon where there is a lack of rationale or there is a lack of logic, that you will pounce on those missings and that lackings and those gaps. And so it becomes part of your approach to these kind of problems, and when then you are already this part, then you then also um, distribute it further for your students and for other scholars and researchers, etc. So tenets, again, I already mentioned this, so I'll say it again. This should have universalism. Basically, scientific temperament must have universalism. That is, you do not choose it according to your convenience when it suits your requirements and then abandon it when it does not. So scientific temperament or temper is not you don't practice it on a choose as I go kind of a act. So one must have this kind of universality or consistency, uh, in practicing or applying a scientific temperament to the activities that you do. And in the same sense and in continuation, it should also reflect to the students, to the scholars, how we are supposed to do it. Freedom from prejudice and bias, not so easy as it is said, but that should be the approach and that should be an effort from our side. Objectivity, of course. When we discuss scientific temperament, we are aiming for accepting or testing or validating or verifying a certain concept of phenomenon. Subjectivity is extremely important. Open-mindedness and humility. Needless to say, this is something which again is based on your personal acquisition as far as your whole approach to life is concerned, as your approach to um, yourself is concerned, etc. A willingness to suspend judgment without sufficient evidence. Again, these are, we live in complex societies, we live in complex times. It's easier said than done, but these are the tenets, and if you're able to do so, follow, then of course you are a person who has or who carries the flame of scientific temper or scientific temperament. Rationality and, of course, perseverance beyond failure as such. So failure should not be a deterrence to your approach of implementing or practicing scientific temperament. I'll go through some of the legacy of Indian systems. Here, of course, the examples are of science, but then that's how the whole essence of how scientific temperament in this India grew. Please understand that India was a colonial rule for 200, 250 years. Many of the, the, the systems that we run or we were running are continuations of what we did during the colonial period. So it takes time for a country, it takes time for a civilization, it takes time from a culture, it takes time for a society to be able to shed everything, and thankfully and fortunately we have been able to shed most of the things that are considered as aspects of colonial hangover, etc. In most of the things. But then there are some positives which are connected to academics or science or scientific development, where we are able to collaborate with the with other countries and other scientific groupings as such. Having said that, having broken away or trying to break, I mean, I can say we have broken away pretty well as far as that hangover is concerned or the colonial past is concerned. But as far as cooperation and collaboration is concerned, we are also excellent in that, in academic world, in the scientific world, etc. So we do garner a lot of scientific temperament from the sharing and the collaboration from other countries as such. However, having said all of that, there is a huge legacy of the Indian system, and it would be not proper to actually not cite or quote some of those examples. This has nothing to do with the current promulgation or promotion of scientific temperament as such directly, but this is the basis from which we were able to also draw that we have a rich legacy of this kind of a temperament because of the contributions that have been made and by certain scientists in India's history from a very long time. I won't be able to cover everybody, but there are a few names, and I'll go through some of them as fast as possible. I also want to make a point that all philosophies of any given era are partially rational. What that statement tries to say is the same thing that I told you. Whichever belief system you work in, whether it's science, religious, or some other humanities, or whatever variation that you have in any of these belief systems that have, and what you choose to be, one or choose to follow one or more. They are all, in any given point of time, they are the best representations of the system that exists or that has borne fruit, or what will bear fruit in the future. And hence they come under the condition that they are not an absolute, but they are an abstraction of what is best at the moment of time or at that point of time. So this is one of the principles of, or the points that one must always keep in mind while going through. And as history goes to show that we were quite argumentative and quite representative in our contribution to the scientific world, to science itself, and most importantly, to developing or having a legacy of our own scientific development in the case. Some very old philosophies, whether it's Nyaya Vaisika, Sankhya Yoga, Advaita Vedanta, Buddhism, Jainism, they all accept the concept of proof. Okay, so if there is an empirical proof, there is an observation. That observation validates the point that you're trying to make or study. Then it is acceptable. Otherwise, it is not. That's the rationale that is being used, and that is a rationale that has been found in across ages in most of these works that have researched about this scientific proofing, or the scientific, what leads to scientific temperament as such. The experimental method uses empirical proof, or proof based on what the evidence is available. This has been a very deep-rooted understanding in ancient India. And then the word pratyaksha, which basically means that you are able to perceive something in your presence. And then, of course, there are other things also. There's the calculated guess, which is the anumana, which is inference or deduction. There is analogy, and then there is the literal word of a proof that exists from previously. All of that, but most importantly, that unless there is some kind of a validating proof, then that concept or notion cannot be considered to be a fact, or cannot be considered to be a factual reality. Now, this should not contest with the with topics like God exists, etc. This is within the realm of what you call research, academic work, science as it was being developed during the time, etc. We have an example from Mahabharata, where there is a story about two people, and a prince and a princess, and Nala and Damayanti announces that that person would marry through competition. So when two competitors, Nala and Rituparna, were going to as the story goes, they were trying to win over this competition to marry princess. There is an example where Rituparna kind of shows the knowledge of statistics by counting the fruits in the branches of a tree, etc. And he then shows off the empirical method by how by sampling he was able to do that. So irrespective of whether you expect or you accept the treaties as such, there are references about these kind of approaches, no matter how abstract they are in our history, that showcase that there was a contribution. We all know about Brahmagupta, who made a mathematician and an astronomer who made his contributions. Before that, we had the person he studied was Payasi, and there were astronomers like Parmashevra, who observed the night sky for 50 years and helped him. Another person, Nilkanta's astronomical model in 16th century, which is said, I mean, it's only a said story, that it was passed on to Europe, and then the European model by Tycho Brahe became what is known as the way that the astronomical model has been described, etc. So there are several examples of these kind of incidents. I've just picked and chosen and picked some of it, which is just to make a point that whether you're talking of ancient text, religious or otherwise, whether you're talking about scientific texts in history of India, you'll have great achievements done by astronomers, mathematicians, names that we all know, names that we all have grown up listening to as examples go, as people who have made this practice of observation, and then through that observation calculations into uh, uh, into books and treatises and other mathematical and other subjective areas. In India, the first attempt by the government to popularize scientific temper was in as early as 1953, created by S.S. Bhatnagar. He was the head of the CSIR at the time, and that is how in modern India, post-independent India, we were able to propose and its purpose of that body, which is pretty famous for all of us now, in where we write projects, etc., and all, is to disseminate scientific information of interest to the rural population and the centers, and to furnish them with scientific tools, films, and books and other materials of learning. They even started scientific periodical called Vigyan Pragati in 1952. Later, it became a scientific report in 1964. Another, I mean, the English version of the journal, and it continued its evolution into National Council for Science, Technology, and Communication in 1982 under DST. So it was mandated to communicate science and technology to the masses. That I kept mentioning in the past, that in the presentation today, that we need to communicate and spread this as much as possible, stimulate scientific technology temper, and coordinate orchestrate such efforts throughout the country. So NCSTC organizes things like National Science Day, an example we saw in one of the previous slides. Uh, and its aim is to foster scientific temper within the country. There are various other organizations that kind of promote the same aim and goal. Some other examples, we all have heard the name Aryabhatta. It was his contributions to the subject of uh, evaluating pi in trigonometry. He was able to give astronomical constants, and through the sine table, he gave mathematics equations required for computations, was able to divide the time and rules for computing longitudes of planets using eccentricities and epicycles. He was also able to give various other contributions as far as trigonometry is concerned. According to a famous historian, Hugh Thurston, Aryabhatta believed during that time that the Earth rotates uh, around the sun, around the orbit of the sun, rather than the sun orbiting there. This is something very famous as far as stories go about Galileo also having said the same thing, for which he was hanged, as they say. But these were observations that were made by an Indian much before those incidents took place. Some of his important achievements, he wrote his entire compilation in 121 verses, was the first person to solve the Diophantine equations, made major contributions to trigonometry and algebra, understood the concept of zero and the place value of the system, calculated the closest approximate value of pi of the time, made incredibly accurate calculations of the length of day and year, was the first to explain that the moon and planets shine due to reflected sunlight, which was uh, at the time must have been a real surprise and shock to many people of the times. He explained how celestial bodies was due to rotation of the earth, authored many other influential texts compiled in Arya Siddhanta. Aryabhatta is one of the towering figures in the world of mathematics and astronomy. Following him was Bhaskara too, who wrote the book or treatise called Lilavati, contains 13 chapters on several mathematical topics, including mensuration, trigonometry, etc. He even researched on the rule of three, which later on would be attributed to Europe 500 years later in the research. He wrote about three major contributions, the Bijaganita, the Ganitadhyaya, and the Goladhyaya. In the first one, it's all about algebra. The second one is about mathematical astronomy, and the third is about spheres and similar shapes and kind of calculations that he aided in their dimensions. Another name, Brahmagupta, we passed through, gave the formula for the area of cyclic quadrilateral. His contributions to geometry are very significant. He is the first person to have discussed the method of finding a cyclic quadrilateral with rational sides. His celebrated theorems are on circuit diameter of a triangle and obtaining diagonals of cyclic quadrilateral, which are very well known. Bhaskara is was Bhaskara, the later the scientist who came later, and we described him a little earlier, was very impressed with Brahmagupta's work, and that's also inspired Bhaskara to do contribute to the kind of work that he was doing. Then we have Varamhira, who was as early as 587 ED. And he also gave certain computations for planets in his famous astronomical treatise Pancha Siddhantika. So there are a lot of examples that come from our ancient history, which go thousands of years, and one leading to other. If we expand on any one of them, then the whole area of research and whole contribution to the scientific research becomes extremely. Some of the modern ones, if you take some modern names, Dattaraya Ramchandra Kaprekar, born on January 17, 1905 in Dhanau, Maharashtra. He was a creational mathematician who described several classes of natural numbers of the, including the Kaprekar, Harshad, and self numbers, and discovered the Kaprekar constant, published extensively and is very well renowned. Narendra Krishna Karmakar, who was born in 57 in Gwalior, is an Indian mathematician who is known for Karmakar's algorithm that solves linear programming problems in polynomial time zones. Polynomial time, I'm sorry. Satyendranath Bose, S.N. Bose, born 1894, Calcutta, renowned physicist, and we all know him from the Bose-Einstein particle, all of which, the Higgs boson particle, etc., which research took over a few years back when the research in Switzerland created, the known scientific principles there. So the class of particles that obey Bose statistics known as bosons was named after him. In 1954, he won the Government of India's Padma Bhushan, etc. And he's best known for his work on quantum mechanics in the early 20s. So even if you see pre and post independence, we have enough people who have contributed to the subject of science, particularly, and of course, pushing in the era of scientific temper. Harish Chandra, October 11, 1923, in Kanpur, India, Indian-American mathematician and physicist known for his fundamental work in representation theory, especially harmonic analysis on semi-simple Lie groups. P.C. Mahalanobis was born in 29 June 1893 in Calcutta, West Bengal. A renowned Indian scientist and applied statistician, he contributed to the Mahalanobis distance, a statistical measure, for being one of the members, and also was one of the members of the Planning Commission in Free India. Is also attributed to founding the Indian Statistical Institute, which is a very world-renowned institution as far as statistical research is concerned within the country and internationally. And then we have C.R. Rao, born September 10, 1920 in Mysore, an Indian born, now an American citizen, but a mathematician and statistician, currently Professor Emeritus at Penn State University in Buffalo, and his work related to statistical inference and linear models, multivariate analysis, combinatorial design, orthogonal arrays, biometry, statistical genetics, generalized matrix inverses, and functional equations. Ramanujam, we are all familiar with the name, born December 2022, 1887, in present-day Tamil Nadu, one of the most recognized Indian mathematicians, although he, despite having no formal training in pure mathematics, is known for number theory, infinite series, and various other problem-solving techniques for the challenges of the day. Venkat Raman, we all know him from the Raman effect, Indian physicist known for his work in light scattering. Using a spectrograph that he developed, he and his student Krishnan discovered that when light travels versus a transparent material, it gets deflected and it changes its wavelength and frequency. Some of the more modern, probably the last slide in this kind of chronology, our beloved president, late President Abdul Kalam, And what he mentioned was that children must inculcate a scientific temper for pursuing knowledge to contribute towards making India one of the most developed countries in the world. So again, an example of one of the foremost scientists of the country and an ex-president who dedicated his life for spreading this scientific temper and temperament through his books. And one of the famous quotes is what we see here, that we must aim that children are able to inculcate scientific temper for pursuing knowledge and then contributing towards making us, our country, a developed nation. Dr. K. Kasturirangan, one of the many famous personalities and a former ISRO chairman, also the chairman of the National Education Policy. Fortunately, he's also part of our institution. His statement is that creating a scientific temper among citizens is as important as creating a vibrant and efficient society, and both are interrelated. So he emphasizes on of course, enhancing the scientific temper as such, while we also create and maintain a vibrant and efficient society. G.N. Tata, in 1958, the government published a scientific policy resolution, and he contributed towards it by saying the dominating feature of contemporary world is the intense cultivation of science on a large scale and its application to meet a country's requirements. So he is also the founder of the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, where I am speaking from right now, and it was formed in 1909. You must understand this was under the British rule. It was extremely difficult for some Indian to be able to create an institution of such excellence as far as scientific research and scientific achievements are concerned, especially given the kind of direction that must have been then at that time under the rule that we were in. So to have that kind of a vision that it would surpass the timelines of independence and grow into this behemoth of scientific contribution towards our country and towards the subjects of science as such, and the way it has actually shined and outshined its competitions around the world is also contributed to the J.N. Tata as such. Now, last few slides on scientific temperament in higher education in India. There are certain points, and this was, I am being very open about it by saying that these are points that was researched very diligently by researchers in the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, and I was lucky enough to glance upon them, and these are some of the most astute points that we can actually apply in as far as suggestions for improvement in higher education is concerned, but with specificity of how we can use scientific temper to do so. So most important, the quality of teachers must be actively pursued. That basically means that even if you're good, there should always be a stress and emphasis on how you improve. So if the teacher keeps improving, it is but natural that the students and the scholars who are also going to go through that scale of improvement. So it is up to the teacher to make science or scientific method or scientific temperament that we're talking about here a challenge or something which you generate an interest in. So it is the first role or first important step in the teacher to being effective. Again, I'll refer to yesterday's talk on effective communication skills and various other soft skills that one can use to make the teacher who motivates the student, increases the interest in science and scientific temper for, rather than presents it in a very rudimentary and traditional fashion, and where it is rote learning that is more emphasized on, or following a certain very structured system is more emphasized on. To build students' interest in science subjects, it's necessary to correlate it with outside classroom learning. So that's how it becomes not just an academic exercise, but an exercise of other activities in the person's life. So that's where the generality of that approach of scientific temper comes into play. So it is not just that's why it is said as a state of being rather than a state of studying. So that is very important. Children can be inspired through parents, teachers, and any healthy interaction between them is extremely important. The facility of all experimental materials should be provided in all secondary science schools, along with proper guidance to help how to avoid these kind of accidental failures. Regular training, facility, and inspection is important, and the concept of scientific attitude can be better understood from the following the list of characteristics. There's an example of a study that was done by Caldwell and Curtis in 1943 on scientific attitudes, and they propounded certain aspects as to how we can improve upon the scientific attitude and what we are referring to as the scientific temper here. The curiosity to know about one's environment must be there for people who are in the learning environment to be able to develop that kind of a scientific temper. The belief that nothing can happen without a cause, and those occurrences that seem strange and mysterious always have natural causes, or in the terms that I'm using, rational or logic, is a connect that each and every student must be able to make. That gets into the practice. And unwillingness to accept as facts any statement that are not supported by convincing proof. We saw this is one of the principal tenets of how ancient literature of most of the religions examples that we covered have kind of supported. The determination not to believe in superstitions of any sort. Of course, this is an evolutionary process and takes time. They believe that truth itself never changes, but that the ideas of what is true change as we gain more and more knowledge. So that's why I said all belief systems are an abstraction, and they are near perfection to the time that we implement them, but this is also always evolving. An intention not to experiment onto the work blindly when carelessly, but to do it after careful observation, and the determination to be careful and accurate in all of one's activities and observations related to that testing and that validating. Willingness to consider all the evidence and try to decide whether it really relates to matter which is being considered is sound, sensible, logical, rational, and can be observed before a conclusion can be made. A determination not based on final conclusions or one or few observations, but as long as necessary in order to secure an answer to the problem. These are some of the observations that made by Caldwell. The desire to do one's own observations and experimentation, but willingness to use results of other scientific work is also accepted, and it should not be shunned away from. Willingness to change an opinion or a conclusion if later evidence found or shows otherwise is also, like I said, to be able to accept something which you are not tuned to, or what is not convenient to you, is also part of actually having a scientific temperament. The intention to respect another's point of view, extremely important, and the determination to prevent one's own likes and dislikes from influencing one's judgments, that is, to remove any kind of bias and prejudices we may have vis-a-vis. So some values in scientific approach. A well-educated person of science is one who excellently exemplifies scientific temper. By exemplify, I mean enhances scientific temper. This person should be able to abide by the values in science in her convictions, actions, and affection, which we studied in the first slide as well. A well-educated person of science is one who, again, I'm repeating, it exemplifies the scientific temper. Person who is able to get an explicit understanding of the values or principles that set the standards of scientific theorizing and practice. This is an example by Karl Popper, who also kind of gave us the falsifiability theorem of any scientific research or principle, a study of a theory for that matter. As a student of scientific temperament, one must learn that all ideas do not have equal value in science. For every idea does not meet the scientific standards of intelligibility, explanatory sweep, and well demonstrated and consistent support of empirical evidence from which the existence of postulated causal entities could be reliably inferred. In very short, all ideas that may go through a scientific methodology may not have the kind of common value system that it may deliver as far as the results may be concerned, or that experiment or the idea itself may be concerned. So hence, one must be willing to be able to differentiate between that, irrespective of how the scientific work that you pursue goes on, or you pursue shows the result of. So in short, what I can say is that if there is a work that has gone on to show that its value in terms of relative comparison to other kinds of scientific work is found to be less, then that should not be a detriment to the pursuit of more works or the same work for the sake of science itself and scientific temperament itself. Learning scientifically is distinct from rote learning. It's something very basic, so I'm not going to repeat that. Scientific temper can rarely flourish when science teaching emphasizes on procedural prediction and ignores the development of explanatory understanding. In very simple terms, rote learning is not what is going to a structured learning system may not affect be as effective as the development of the capacity to think, apply, and generate ideas through scientific temperament as it could do through some structured learning processes. Some continuation uh, on how scientific temperament and the stories of science and the successful stories of science work on the principles, ethics, and other things. Some points on that. People are highly influenced by mythologies, fables, stories, folklore, and in the society, it passes from generation to generation at an early stage. And this is excellent as far as social narratives go, social cohesion goes. But when it comes to generating a scientific temperament, it should not overtake or overshadow the capability of a person to develop scientific temper. Scarcity of a skilled person in different socioeconomic dimensions of society also inhibits development of scientific temper in the society. So it's not just an individual challenge; it's also a societal challenge. Lack of efficiency in educational enterprises is also a detriment to the development of scientific temper in society. Superstitious beliefs, of course, form a major hindrance, and the population and what extent their historical and socio-cultural history basically pushes them towards uh, the the uh, the exploration of how science and scientific temperament would lead to the betterments also a part of the exercise that one needs to go through if one is to able to inculcate that in day-to-day life. Lack of proper initiative, both on the part of the government or the system or the people, these are all hindrances to improving what we call scientific temperament. Conservative outlook, traditional thinking. When I say traditional thinking, it is not in direct connection to the traditions we follow. This is basically just restrictive thinking, orthodoxies that inhibit any inclusion of a different idea or a different process within their lives, within the day-to-day life and the influence areas that touches them. That is a reference towards that. Lack of awareness about rights and duties also is an hindrance. Of course, economic conditions, lack of professional courses, practical programs. These are all things we have already covered. They all generate hindrances towards achieving what you call scientific temperament within the community and within the society. Gender-based discrimination, poor social consciousness, media's bias, uh, various other categorizations within the country, and negative influences all hinder any kind of development of scientific temperament. Scientific temper is not restricted to those who pursue science. It is in fact a way of life. We've covered this several times. And what should be able to do so with these approaches that the adventure and yet critical temper of science must be pursued. The search for truth and new knowledge should always be a priority. The refusal to accept anything without testing and trial must be a common practice. The capacity to change previous conclusions in the face of new evidence must be an humble learning and acceptable experience. The reliance on observed fact and not a preconceived theory and the hard discipline of the mind must be accepted and inculcated. All these are necessarily, but not the only areas with which one can find solution for life and its many problems. So in the end, the big question, can we survive as a society without scientific temper? Probably. But the question that is more important is that can we thrive as a society without scientific temper? I would tend to decline on the second. So it is extremely important that it is extremely possible to actually survive without scientific temper, but I don't think it is possible to thrive and develop and evolve and become whatever aspirations that society or that country has vis-a-vis, you know, being developed or being aspirational and being able to fulfill its aims and achievements without scientific temper. Before ending, I'll just give a few so small example, anecdotal example. And this country I keep referring to, I was most of us, maybe even in the audience, who have a better understanding of or have had more experience in subject that we spoke about today, must have seen this. This is not something only I have experienced, but this is something very unique to a particular country that I was in. And they have evolved a system by which whatever we are trying to achieve now with the new education policy, where we are trying to differentiate or actually align a vocational training skill set along with traditional education system, has been done decades ago in this particular example of a country that I'm trying to give here. And what that does is that it is able to unite the whole country or the whole society, all the people in that country, into a system whereby, based on the skill set and the interest and the orientation of every individual, the testing mechanism works in a way that that you are, though you are free to choose what you want to pursue, I mean, vis-a-vis your interest, you are also given the benefit of the information as to where your real talents lie. Now, this is, of course, based on certain training, certain learnings and experiences that this individual may have gathered by the time this person reaches, 11th and 12th standard or its equivalent. But the kind of nationalized and universal testing that this system does, and the way they are able to differentiate and delineate what kind of acumen, what kind of uh, specialization one may be able to pursue given the qualities and the training and the experience and the nature and the personality and the scientific temperament, etc., are imbibed within that individual, and how that would be the best possible way of actually going and pursuing that type of career. It works in such a rhythmic succession that my first question to them was, what happens if the system decides that such and such person is not wanting to choose a certain line of career, a line of job, and is interested to do in his own interest. But the system and the testing that the system does shows that that line is not appropriate, and somehow another line or another subject or another discipline is more suited. Wouldn't that be, some kind of a curb on the individual right or the fundamental right of the individual to be able to choose what line he or she must pursue? I got a very tempered answer on that, and that is very difficult to analyze or assess at this point of time. But what I understood was that because of the success rate that they've had with this kind of a system, where the way the testing is done in such a way that it is best suited. It is not supposed to cheat or suit according to what the system decides, but best suited to that each individual's potential in pursuing a certain line or discipline of that system has become so refined, and with the number of success rates that it has generated, it has, as individuals, as groups of individuals, as civil society, as parents, as the government, as the policymakers, all of it included, this has helped that country to become one of the leading technological leaders of the world. Okay, so that example is already there. The whole approach sounds very rudimentary and very enforced, but that there lies and there comes in the example of scientific temperament and what kind of temper they have used in finding a solution for their society, where maximum number of people then become employed, and not just employed, but they get employed in the best suited avenues based on individuals' qualities, capabilities, etc. I do not think we can implement that kind of a system, for lack of better word, that will be too much stringency on our personal choices, etc. But then the approach of how they have been able to resolve or solve their problem of unemployment through higher education, through higher qualification, through improvement in the education, quality of education, etc., is something worth mentioning, at least here. So while we are still a developing country with great achievements in our, in our kitty, in our bucket, vis-a-vis all the things that we are doing, from space to nuclear to various other lines and disciplines as such, individually and as a collective, all of us. There's always this journey that we have to take while we transform ourselves from a developing to the developed nation or developed country. And the one thing that we cannot give amiss is the presence, the overwhelming presence, the universality of its presence of what we talk today, and that is scientific temper. Thank you. I will end my talk here. I'll hand over the forum to the host.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for in very informative talk on scientific temperament. Uh, can I ask any participant if they have any point to discuss or point to share or any question to be addressed by resource person? Kindly write it in the chat box. We can take one or two questions. Yes, I think there is the comments are like nice session, very thoughtful session. Dr. Amit sir, you started the scientific temperament from giving insight over observation and inherent curiosity, which is the basic of any transformation that is to be expected. Scientific temper with and the society was something which related and bridged the science and different needs of society. You also shared about the tenets, 8 tenets to follow, followed by the legacy of Indian system, where you took us back to our proud scientists. And what I can summarize is that scientific temperament can only be reached through experiential learning, which need to be exercised in our teaching, learning, or any experimentation about knowledge sharing we are exercising. So thank you so much for being with us, sir. And
Thank you.
both the session were very thoughtful, very wonderful, and very informative. On behalf of Department of Computer Science and AICT, I thank you for being with us for this faculty development program. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you. It was a privilege. Thank you. All the best to all.
Thank you, sir. The question, ma'am, I want to ask you, today is the last day of training. Didn't you went through the uh, uh, schedule that I have already been given? Yes, it is the last day because it is the 5-day training program. So the feedback and quiz, please. Feedback, once you finish your today's sessions, you will be able to get the feedback into your login itself. You have to go to your login in the AICT ATAL section. You will get the feedback. It will not be open now because the session is not yet completed. About the quiz, please, yes, we will be the link will be shared to you by 5:30 for MCQ type examination. Okay, so wish you all the best and come at 3 o'clock for the last session of the FDP.